Okay, thank you. I just want to endorse what Ben was saying there about the changed relationship between academics, universities, and students, although I want to be wary in this paper of the concept of student partnership because we need to be careful how this is conceived. I'm just going to read out the paper. I hope that's okay. It's been carefully formed as an argument, so I'm reluctant to diverge from the structure I've given it here. So the paper explores the concept of student partnership in British higher education institutions. It begins with a brief overview of student partnership as a policy attempt to give greater power and voice to university students in relation to structures and processes relating to teaching, assessment and quality assurance. Ostensibly, the policy aims to cultivate student engagement in place of potential consumer passivity. Yet careful consideration also has to be given to the legitimate authority of students and teachers in higher education settings. This is done in two distinct ways. First, through a reading of authority based on Hannah Arendt's essay, What is Authority? And that comes from the book Between Past and Future. And I asked Michelle very kindly put the picture up on the slide this morning. You're probably aware that the cover picture of the Roman god Janus having two faces, one facing towards the past and one towards the future. And the idea here is pertinent because I want you to have in the back of your minds the idea that students operating under high levels of indebtedness and high levels of tuition fees are very much facing towards the future. And I'm relying in this argument on the notion that academics are rooted in tradition and in the past, and therefore they're faced in two opposing directions. Anyway, the implications of our understanding of authority are considered in relation to the concept of student partnership. And second, this conception of authority is imagined in a seminar setting. The overarching argument is that by asserting the authority of students as partners with academics, students are ultimately denied the opportunity to acquire authority with respect to their subject disciplines. The concept of student partnership, as it's presently understood in increasingly commodified universities in Britain, undermines the transfer of authority from the good teacher to the good student and robs higher education of its intrinsic value. Once students and teachers no longer recognise authoritative relations between one another, the possibility of an authoritative teacher trusted by the student is diminished, and the university's ability to confer scholarly or scientific authority upon its graduates weakens. Now, I want to say before I begin the paper properly that this was a jointly written piece with a colleague at the University of Birmingham called Elizabeth Stadden. So I also take responsibility for the work in here. It's not all my own. Students as partners. In November 2008, Paul Ramsden, who was then Chief Executive of the HEA and advisor to the UK government, published a paper entitled The Future of Higher Education Teaching and the Student Experience, in which he aimed to provide a reference point for policy decisions about teaching and the student experience over the next 10 to 15 years. In that paper, he set out how higher education institutions were already responding to what he framed as students' evolving expectations and what they must do in order to meet future challenges. His vision was for UK higher education to become an engaged partnership between students and providers. Within the single conception of students and partnership, Ramsden seemed to tackle numerous impending challenges facing a UK system under increasing threat from global competition. Most strikingly, the partnership motif simultaneously countered one of the most negative potentials of marketisation, the notion of students as passive consumers of their education, while retaining one of the most special features of the UK brand to ensure future competitiveness, that being intimacy of pedagogical relationships. According to Ramsden, the potential to improve the UK's market position lay in the possibility that engaging students as collaborators in institutional structures and processes relating to teaching and assessment would provide a mechanism for improving the quality of the student experience. Indeed, higher education institutions were increasingly positioning their students in this way, using student representatives as central contributors to the business of enhancing the student experience. In turn, sharing responsibility through student partnership would contribute to a more innovative approach to quality assurance in order to meet student, parent and employer accountability standards. Underscore student diversity as a strength rather than as a threat to standards, teaching quality and student experience, and produce graduates ready to meet the challenges of the future. Ramsden supported his case by appealing to future market demands, a long tradition of academic culture stretching back at least to Humboldt, in which higher education is envisaged as teacher and student engaged together in a process of inquiry, and abundant evidence to support creating higher education environments in which students are part of a community of learners, working with academics to enhance teaching, assure quality, and maintain standards. The concept of students in partnership, it would seem, neatly unifies worthy historical conceptions of knowledge creation within a research setting with the new demands of higher education in the marketplace. Moreover, it has a capacity to both offset the negative impacts of marketisation on student identity while serving the same market, and its effectiveness is supported by evidence. Whatever the merits or demerits of Ramsden's claims, indeed more recent and thorough publications note a negligible evidence base linked to student engagement with university structures and processes. The conception of students as partners, recognised as beneficial for student engagement and as an antidote to a passive consumerist approach to education, has been adopted and promoted with zeal by the Quality Assurance Agency, Higher Education Academy and the Students' Union to some extent, and consequently by many individuals within universities with a stake in advancing learning and teaching. To give a brief flavour, the HEA has run 2 change programmes since 2011, respectively entitled Students as Partners and Students as Partners in the Curriculum. The first aimed to support higher education institutions with developing capacity to involve students in institutional changes in curriculum design, quality assurance and enhancement, institutional decision-making and student transition, progression and achievement. The second focuses more specifically on working with students to enhance the curriculum. These programmes specify that students should be treated as equal rather than as inferior partners. Project teams must comprise representatives from both student and staff communities in almost equal number, and listed principles of working with students as partners includes developing shared purpose, values and principles, and joint decision-making and accountability arrangements. Other projects and literature proceeding from the Students as Partners movement echo or even exceed this principle of equality by elevating students to leadership roles, such that students are identified as co-designers of courses, pedagogical consultants, and strategy developers. Student partnership gives university students voice within higher education. It shifts the student's role from passive consumer with freedom of exit from the marketplace towards active participation with freedom of voice. It's an important acknowledgement that a simple market model of academic producers and student consumers is flawed in relation to education, as Ben was saying in his introduction. However, in seeking to give voice to students by bureaucratic imperative, we argue here that the policy misunderstands the role that authority plays in education and ignores a fundamental distinction between authoritative teaching and an exploitative relationship between academic educators and the students. In effect, power relations between academic teachers and students are confused with the relations of authority. Ramsden's focus on partnership increases student voice, but in doing so disrupts academic authority. That paragraph is probably a linchpin in the argument, because I want to claim that what's being confused here is power with authority. Authority being power plus recognition of that authority, and that recognition leading to obedience, rather than pure power, which means obedience through violence or threat of violence. There is a risk that the meaning of academic authority may be misunderstood here. Our argument might be construed as a vested resistance to including students in matters of purely academic concern. This is not our claim. Rather, we hope to show that a rich grasp of the notion of authority is at the heart of a higher education. Education is a process of recognition that builds authority in students. Ramsden's idea is superficially appealing because it aspires to recognizing student authority, but the authority involved is legitimated by policy assertion rather than diligent application to learning and understanding an academic tradition. We'll trace Hannah Arendt's development of the notion of authority within her essay, What is Authority?, and how it can be related to higher education in order to advance the understanding of authority that we wish to encourage. We focus upon Arendt's conception of authority for 2 reasons. First, her view of authority connects with action and participation in the world. Indeed, Arendt conceives of education specifically in terms of preparation for action. Secondly, parallels can be drawn between the child-centered or progressive education that Arendt attacked in her essay, in the same book, by the way, The Crisis of Education, and an instrumental model of higher education encouraged by high tuition fees and a focus on employability. These forms of education provide insufficient insulation for the development of the student and resist the notion of authority on the part of the tutor. Arendt argues that the concept of authority is misunderstood, for authority is not about less freedom or more orderliness. Neither should it be concerned with less student voice or more university teachers who've completed a teaching qualification and been awarded HEA fellowships. This simplistic view of authority hides important differences between tyranny, democracy, authoritarianism, and totalitarianism in politics. Arendt points out that the lack of clarity over the concept of authority goes so deep that parents face a crisis of authority in raising children because of an absence of tradition that can be passed on to them. In the same way, university teachers may face a crisis in authority if they increasingly lack an ethical tradition to pass on to their students. A higher education that's oriented towards the future in terms of employability, happiness and income will inevitably confront a crisis of authority. An inability to grasp authority except in terms of freedom and orderliness is a result of the dominance of liberal and conservative political thought which conceal meaning in a focus on the functional level. Authority demands obedience, so it is not surprising that the concept is confused with lack of freedom or with power or violence. But authority is not concerned with external means of coercion. Rather, it is recognized. As Arendt says, where force is used, authority itself has failed. Neither is authority concerned with persuasion, because persuasion presupposes equality and works through a process of argumentation. It is worth noting that authority explicitly rules out the co-constructive egalitarian relations involved in students as partners. What operates in higher education is, to be sure, a relation of isonomy, or equality of reason in teacher and student, but against the backdrop of the teacher's authority. Obedience occurs in a relation of trust. Socrates' execution by the state for corrupting the youth of Athens demonstrated to Plato that persuasion and reason cannot control the passions of the public sphere. A polis regulated only by free speech and reason will not sustain freedom given the crooked timber of humanity. Free speech alone is not enough. For what point is speech when nobody is required to listen? The liberal concept of free speech would not have interested the Athenians. Liberty needs people inclined to hear, and those listening others should also be free with an open-minded but critical attitude, ready to use their own reason to form judgments. Not everyone, unfortunately, is subject to the force of reason. Authority commands an obedience to listen, but this obedience is not coerced. This suggests that authority involves trust. As Jenko Kojelda explains, obedience can be the result either of the use of coercive power or of authority. However, in the first case, obedience depends on the person who possesses power, but in the second, just the opposite is true. It depends on those who recognize and acknowledge the authority of the person who has the right to command obedience. The correlative of authority is trust. How can freedom be preserved alongside obedience? Well, for Plato, there was no easy answer. Athens, as a direct participatory democracy, had no experience of public authority. Law was determined there through the public use of reason by all citizens. So Plato turned to the household for a model of authority. In the household, he saw the authority of the despotic father, who preserved freedom for his family. We may also have a note that parental authority involves trust from the child. Political freedom for the citizen requires a force external to those in power. In the Republic, Plato proposes that law has this function of an external force beyond the powerful. The democratic government, to maintain freedom, must operate within the rule of law and can only alter law through due process. In order to force these many, for whom reason is unpersuasive to follow the law, Plato provides the myth of hell, the idea of an afterlife that punishes the law-breaking bad for eternity. Thus, fear of hell reigns in the passions of those unable to control their passions through reason. The student as partner, with an overriding fear of indebtedness and future underemployment, might be said to have reigned in passion. Those of our students who arrive at university with overwhelmingly instrumental attitudes towards their studies are present in lectures and tutorials and hand in their essays, but they do so while operating under a misconception of what their higher education is about. The intellectual passion of the academic and student working in partnership under an idea of mastery of a craft is dissolved in the acidity of instrumental higher education. What's required is some external force that will help rebalance attitudes back towards a deepening of intellectual understanding. Now, Plato argues by analogy. In matters of health, we defer to the physician. In sailing, to the helmsman. In politics, we should defer to the expert in ideas and laws. The wisest, for Plato, hold the authority to rule because the compelling element lies in the relationship itself and is prior to the issuance of commands. For Arendt, however, this is absurd. There is no expert in human affairs. Political matters, relationships between people, in a democracy can only be considered through free and open discussion, where the words of the speaker hold the power to persuade. Whoever best understands the situation is the person we want to listen to. This person, however, is unlikely to have the best grasp of all situations. Therefore, even when we listen to the speaker with the best understanding of the situation, we should be inclined towards a skeptical attitude. The expert who supports his authority through threats of violence or hell in the afterlife diminishes freedom for the citizen or congregation, just as the threat of grades too low to impress future employers diminishes freedom for the real student or teacher. Teachers and students in higher education ought to incline towards skepticism, yet also incline towards listening to one another in the context of interpreting, understanding, and judging the subject matter of their discipline. The skills involved here are empathetic and rhetorical, an openness to listen to others, sharing views about the good or justice. The seminar room, then, is a vision of the polis, requiring skill in explaining one's own views, skill in listening to the views of others, skill in bringing the two into relation with one another in a way that highlights their strengths and diminishes their weaknesses, and skill once again in explaining the tentative synthesis that one has arrived at for the benefit of others who are, of course, engaged in a similar exercise. The Romans had one centre of authority in Rome. Rome grew and developed. The empire was built upon a central founding. The development of the Roman Empire meant that life in the world involved constantly keeping Rome in view as the founding idea. Auctoritas, Arendt tells us, derives from augere, to augment. And what those in authority augment is the foundation. Authority rested upon the wisdom of the elders who held the foundation in view for all things to come. Ultimately, therefore, authority rested on the founders who were no longer alive, with the ancestors rather than those who held actual power. For Arendt, the political structure rests on the trinity of religion, tradition, and authority. It is maintained in attitudes, in ethics, rather than in ideas. Religio means to tie back, in the sense that the present is tied back to the past. Those in authority were those who could interpret the meaning of the foundations. Those in authority had to be old and plausibly connected to the foundation itself. When the Roman Empire collapsed and the church filled the space vacated, it founded itself not as a community of believers, not in obedience to the commandments of God, but upon a foundation of the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The church drew its authority from the stories of the Bible and its ability to interpret these. The foundation of Rome was repeated in the Christian church. Upon becoming political, replacing Rome, the church altered its own self-understanding. It gave itself a foundation. The fathers of Roman thought and culture were, of course, not Romans at all, but Plato and Aristotle. So the church adopted a Roman foundational authority and the Platonic problem of how to control the passions. Rather than the law, the church employed the commandments. Without justification, the commandments required the threat of violence, the threat of hell to ensure obedience. With this came the corruption of the elite as the political space was closed down. Where violence is used, authority is already dead. But fear of hell didn't last. Once hell had lost its coercive power, people no longer feared violating the notion of good. We might ask whether the coercion of debt and redeeming employment is enough for students to fear violating the idea of studying well. We might go further still and ask whether the university teacher, stripped of the authority of the foundation, will be able to teach the students what it means to study well, what it means to inquire and study deeply. By the early modern period, the time of Machiavelli, church and state were already thoroughly corrupt. Machiavelli attempted to re-establish the state, these foundation-based institutions. He wanted a new foundation made in the present, rather than harking back to the past, but creating a foundation in the present, as in a revolution, for example, required a willingness to use violence. To think of making or fabricating a foundation is to invoke a household category and to use it inappropriately in a political situation, at least according to Arendt's way of thinking. A category relevant to the oikos is applied to the polis. Fabricating foundations, as Ramsden tries to do with student partnership in order to build a world, does violence to pre-existing understandings of higher education. To carry authority, the foundation must carry some respected presence in order to persuade people that it should be built on. The Roman Empire and the Church had foundations in the past. This made it easier for it to command respect and to be considered as carrying the wisdom of the ages. For Arendt, the only successful modern attempt at creating a foundation in the present can be found in the American Revolution. American citizens regard their Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as sacred documents framed by the Founding Fathers. It succeeded, she thought, because it emerged not out of revolution, but out of a war with England. The Constitution was not a document intended for the victors to rule the defeated. Moreover, it was based upon a framework, Montesquieu's analysis of the English Constitution, which already existed, so it did appeal to the notion of reaching back in time to the elders. A higher education constitutional arrangement founded on student partnership has to acknowledge the foundational idea of the university. This will mean passing authority from one generation to the next, but harking back to what has been passed on, not just forward to student employability or some other weak promise. Regimes without political space are quickly exhausted. They become increasingly irrational. Real life is lived, Arendt maintains, in political space. And when that space is closed off, a person trying to act within it becomes embarrassed. She cannot be herself. The idea of meritocracy gave energy to education and to politics. The cost, however, has been the disappearance of the conservative notion of noblesse oblige. Those at the top of the social hierarchy no longer regard themselves as obligated in any way to those beneath them. Now we face a double problem. The concept of meritocracy is in crisis, and this is coupled with a lack of sense of responsibility. All feel a sense of entitlement. The poor feel entitled to social benefits because, given the patent lack of equal opportunity, while the rich feel entitled to their wealth because they perceive their wealth as deserved. Sorry about the typo there. We're left devoid of political space. Either tyranny or totalitarian government, or an empty democracy without foundational structure, run by career politicians or careerist academic managers in the case of universities who operate with real authority. Who operate without real authority. In relation to our higher education system, we might suggest that in the 1960s in Britain we had our own foundation in the present, the social democratic expansion of the universities after the Robbins Report in '63. While the system briefly opened up a moment in democratic political space, this has since been closed down by a technocratic political class administering a technocratic higher education. While Arendt hoped for the vita activa, the active life in political space, and direct participation in the political world, we do not even have representative democracy, and we do not have a politics where the wisdom of the ages is passed to us by elders with authority. It should therefore come as no surprise that the universities, provided by a bureaucratic state, lack a strong political aspect. Our schools, colleges and universities have been undermined by this absence of authority. The idea that education develops judgment and practical reason, where a foundation of understanding is passed down through the generations, is increasingly substituted by an instrumental training. Of course, many academics resist an instrumentalist view of education, but this does not prevent functionalist tendencies in policy change. Knowledge is taught, but its purpose is to provide material to test against. The purpose of this is twofold. On the one hand, to generate certificates and credentials for future employees to take to higher levels of education and eventually to the labour market, and also to monitor the efficiency via accountability of the educational institution itself. This knowledge is not regarded as good in itself. It is not the knowledge which is valued, but the skills or technique developed in the person being trained or the function of using knowledge to police the educational institution. These skills will develop into a skill set of value to the business. The more productive these skills are, the more value attached and the higher the wage paid to the owner of human capital. The authority of a knowledge foundation that harks back to the past is displaced by the power of skills that are anticipated as useful in the future. In the case of accountability, through performativity, the knowledge involved itself holds no authority, for its purpose is to test and monitor the value of the institution. Authority, or rather what is taken to be authority, but lacks legitimation through recognition, clearly resides in the monitoring agencies rather than the educational institution. In the first of these purposes, generating future-oriented credentials and qualifications, the purchaser in the labour market, that is the future employer, has an interest in pushing down the price of the purchase. Pay less for more qualifications. In the second, accountability, there is an interest on the part of the educational institution in increasing the qualifications awarded. There is a cost push and a demand pull side to this equation. Employers demand more, and schools, colleges and universities award more qualifications. The result is qualification or grade inflation. But this is not the only result, for in the process of inflation, the currency is degraded and devalued, like a gold coin that has been slipped away at the edges until it is no longer valued as legal tender. The education involved here rarely carries the wisdom of the ages, rarely harks back to the foundation, and rarely carries authority. Authority in education, then, is not directly about a hierarchy between teacher and student. Authority is not a curtailment of freedom. Rather, it is concerned with the passing on of culture through knowledge, skills, practices, and attitudes, and involves the trust of the student. Education is augmenting and building on the foundation of our world. Education, then, makes authority possible, and public education, resourced by revenues collected by the state from citizens, should attempt to open up political space in order to create institutional structures capable of carrying and building upon authority. Authority demands obedience, as I've said numerous times, yet is not power, violence, or persuasion. It harks back to the past, to the foundation of culture. The deepening relationship with ideas in the past is not, however, familiar to the student as partner. For the student as partner does not identify with the notion of scholarship as craft, an apprentice working under a master. The student as partner stands between present and future without reference to any foundation in the scholarly tradition. The student here holds more power via vague notions of consumer sovereignty, but the authority of the academic teacher is weakened. In weakening the teacher's authority, the possibility of the student acquiring authority is lost. The supposedly higher education received is one with an eye firmly on the imagined employer rather than outmoded ideas. The authority brought through mastery is lost on students and staff operating in an unsustainable world of perceived high fees, high debt, employability, skills for work, and student satisfaction. Unsustainable in part because of practical problems such as unaffordable debt write-downs by the Treasury, but also because of the forces that push higher education away from an ethical attitude to the foundation of intellectual mastery and consequently loses its legitimate authority. Higher education in the sense of authoritative legitimate higher education rather than merely the hollow appearance, in the absence of political space, will be quickly exhausted. The idea of student partnership, where it undermines academic authority, removes the purpose of studying. Teachers and lecturers should not allow the concept of student partnership to be regarded as a panacea for the cleavage in interests between the academic and the student, caused by high-level fees and a shift in the cultural understanding of the goals of university study. The university seminar represents a useful educational setting through which to explore distinctions between the student partnership model, which advocates co-construction between students and tutors, and a conception that's rooted in tutor authority. The seminar is routinely described to students as a forum for learning collectively. The role of the tutor is not to teach or assert her knowledge, but to facilitate student discussion. We begin by imagining a seminar based on the principles of co-teaching or co-learning. In the report on student engagement, Little and others make special mention of an interviewee who they believe conveys a sense of staff and students being partners in learning. All students and staff are here to learn and learn from each other, and the only distinction is age and experience. This attitude mirrors closely a type of teacher envisaged by Stephen Brookfield as he sets out the kinds of errors made by teachers who neglect to reflect critically on assumptions about teaching and power dynamics inherent to educational environments. Brookfield says, teachers committed to working democratically often declare their at oneness with students, believing themselves and their students to be moral equals. They like to say to them, I'm no different from you, so treat me as your equal. Act as if I wasn't a teacher but a friend. The fact that there's a temporary imbalance between us in terms of how much I know about this subject is really an accident. We're co-learners and co-teachers, you and I. Perhaps this phrasing stretches the point a little, but Brookfield aims to show that communicating to students that they are co-teachers is insincere. Students know that their teachers have expertise, experience, skill and knowledge, which they themselves don't have, and denial of this results in mistrust. Brookfield argues that over time, when trust has been established, students might accept the role of co-teachers, but first the teacher has to establish credibility, and the students have to know what she stands for. Brookfield conveys the necessity of a process in which the tutor first assumes her authority, establishes her credibility, and the student gradually assumes his. Not only does the student know that the teacher has expertise that he doesn't have, but he also brings with him to the seminar a raft of learnt habits of reliance, hostility, or both towards authority figures which cannot be broken instantly, if at all. Whether the tutor admits to it or not, she will find herself in a position of authority or power or both. The student will look to her for guidance, and to that extent he will be in a relation of dependence, which in turn will require a degree of obedience. Power and authority both require obedience, and are therefore easily confused. In the concrete situation of the seminar, attitudes to authority and confusions between authority and power might manifest in a variety of behaviours. There is a student who persistently confronts the tutor or even insistently quarrels with the authority of the text or authors under discussion. There's a student who prefers to command the attention of his tutor rather than listening to his peers. There is a student who persistently seeks praise from the tutor or listens intently to everything she says as he writes it down. There are the students who chat amongst themselves instead of joining the discussion. There is the student who tells the tutor what she wants to hear, mindful of the fact that she will be marking his assignment. The tutor who attempts to give away authority by claiming we're all on the same level in order to create an atmosphere of openness and participation makes it impossible for students to recognize her authority and implies a false equality. By denying the presence of authority, she denies her students the means of recognizing and acquiring authority for themselves. Within the etymology of the words seminar, student and tutor lies an understanding of the type of authority that we have advocated. Seminar literally means breeding ground or plant nursery and shares the same Latin root as the word semen, meaning seed. Student derives from studere, meaning to apply oneself diligently, and tutor derives from tuere, meaning watcher, protector or guardian. The tutor, then, might be conceived to guard or watch over the seminar from which ideas and judgment can develop. He protects the conditions for those who are diligently applying themselves to a matter at hand in order to enable growth. Watching or guarding over conveys a pastoral dimension that extends beyond promoting acquisition of knowledge or skills, although these might also comprise an important element of the seminar. The seminar tutor might give space for the hesitant student to air her views, gently restrain the overbearing or arrogant student, make connections between ideas, and suggest new ways of looking at a topic. The tutor holds authority over the student through his connection to past foundations. He has read the text under discussion, hopefully, but has also read other works by the same author, and that author's contemporaries or predecessors and successors. Perhaps he has written about the text himself, or discussed and clarified his own ideas with scholars in the field. He recognizes patterns of ideas and can clarify meanings when the seminar begins to flounder. The tutor as protector wants his students to acquire authority too. The criterion that he uses to distribute authority is effective reasoning, and this might take different forms from discipline to discipline. The good tutor recognizes effective arguments, insightful critical comments, or exceptional cases, and shows his students that he recognizes them too, in effect bestowing and increasing authority onto them. He might use subtle cues of recognition to indicate when the kind of authority he is trying to nurture is present. When he says, "That's a very interesting point you've raised about such and such," he conveys to the student, "You're on the ball, and I've noticed it." And at the same time, he's pointing this out to the other students. "That student talking about such and such is onto something, and you should recognize it." By doing this, the tutor is showing, rather than telling, the students how to exercise their own judgment. At the same time, he steers them towards the idea that no one is expert at everything. He encourages his students to become skeptical, to listen carefully to others, including himself, and to discern. Initially, the sovereignty to distribute authority resides in the tutor, but over time it may be devolved throughout the class. The tutor might use tactics to distribute authority by asking students if they would like the seminar to be organized differently, owning up to a mistake, or exposing himself in some way to destabilize his position as an authority figure. The role of the tutor here might be to watch over or protect authority itself as it grows within the seminar group. The process that we've described is a dynamic one, whereby students in higher education acquire authority over time and under the guardianship of an educator who accepts and exhibits her own authority within a relationship of trustful obedience. Our authoritative educator is concerned with developing both knowledge and cultivating judgment that is rooted in the past but that projects well into the future. In contrast, the notion of students as partners assumes that past foundations are unimportant. It creates a foundation in the past to limit the possibility of a dissatisfied future. Students detached from past foundations and encouraged to take an instrumental approach to their learning are detached from the tutor. They cannot be expected to recognize the authority of the tutor to protect and watch over their progress, which puts tutor and student at cross purposes rather than in relations of meaningful partnership. The end.